Hi, I am Marcela Cely-Santos, and I will share these intersections between rural livelihood security and animal pollination in Anolaima, Colombia. So bees and other pollinators are on decline. These declines result from the convergence of several factors, including the loss and fragmentation of their original habitats, the use of herbicides and pesticides, and climate change, which negatively influence feeding and nesting resources for them, and pesticides also affect pollinators' immunological and detoxifying systems, making them prone to diseases. Many of these factors are associated to the expansion of industrial agriculture. And all this is puzzling because animal-mediated pollination contributes with about 35% of the global food production by benefiting at different levels about 75% of the crop species grown worldwide. It has been estimated that this pollination represents about $14 billion for agricultural production. Most of this production goes to feed people. Animal-pollinated crops have high contents of micronutrients including vitamin A, folate, and iron. Absence of those micronutrients, known as hidden hunger, can limit human development and cause diseases including anemia or blindness and malformations in newborns. Therefore, producing animal-pollinated crops is important globally, but particularly in regions where people access food primarily from their farms and from local circuits, as in the case of rural communities in tropical developing countries. In these regions, the most common production systems are traditional small-scale farms taken care by people like Maribel who enjoy keeping a high diversity of animals and plants, and where they strive to find autonomy by securing what they eat, and where they find freedom to define what is meaningful for them and freedom to know and relate with others. But the persistence of traditional diversified systems is also threatened by the expansion of industrial agriculture, which is currently concentrated in those tropical developing countries and is bringing changes in food production, access, and consumption. On the one hand, crop diversity decreases with agricultural industrialization, and on the other, agrarian change influences how people access food. Some people can either grow or purchase their foods, while others greatly depend on the integrity of the resource base to secure diets. Despite the importance of both bees, pollinators, and smallholders, we do not understand the interdependence of pollinators and humans and how those relationships change in a sociocultural context of agrarian transformation. I would like to contribute to a more holistic understanding of those intersections between animal pollination and rural livelihoods in Anolaima, Colombia, a small town located on the eastern flank of the Andes Mountains, and that used to be called the fruit capital of Colombia. Most likely, it built its identity with the help of hundreds of wild native pollinators like these social, semi-social, and solitary bees we have found in the study region. People in Anolaima don't think this is the fruit capital of Colombia anymore. They said that in the last decades, agricultural profitability has declined considerably, and with it, the sustainability of livelihoods and landscapes. This may be related to the fact that historically there is marked land inequality, where few farmers own farms larger than 20 hectares and most people access farms with less than 1 hectare, and this also marks a differential access to capital. After the introduction and expansion of Green Revolution technologies during the 1970s, two systems of production are coexisting in the region. Traditional and diversified ones intensive in labor and local knowledge that give higher stability over the long term, and industrial systems to grow cheap foods with high variability in revenues. People in the region mentioned that after the introduction of Green Revolution technologies, they are not growing some crops anymore. In an exercise with some ladies that have traded foods for the last 30 years in the farmers' market, this is what they said was grown and traded before, and this is what is found today. Women also mentioned volumes and sizes of produce have decreased considerably. And just these changes invite to think about the effect of agrarian change and relations with life forms influencing food production. So considering the dynamics between traditional and industrial food production in Anolaima and thinking about the underlying social inequalities, there should be differences in what people grow and how they access food. So, nested in political ecology and how vulnerability and marginalization emerge from power dynamics that shape the management of the environment, I aim to understand whether households differ in their vulnerability to pollinator declines. And specifically, I evaluated what was the contribution of animal-pollinated crops to the richness of foods grown and consumed across households, and whether this contribution was contingent on socioeconomic factors associated to agrarian change in Anolaima. To answer those questions, I conducted a survey and interviews with focus households, and I approached crop diversity through survey data asking what crops were grown, and dietary diversity through food journals and food recalls from focus households. I crossed information about what people were producing and consuming with literature on the contribution of animal pollination for those different foods. And we also collected sociodemographic data from both survey and focus households for our analysis. So in terms of food production, let me show you this graph. We see the number of crops in the x-axis and the number of households growing them in the y-axis, and whether those foods were for sale or for consumption within the household. In this panel, we see that crops not benefiting by animal pollination were popular across households and more diverse when talking about subsistence than cash crops. Subsistence crops were plantain, manioc, and arracacha, and cash crops were peas, beans, and green beans. In these upper panels, we see crops benefiting from animal pollination. And in general, this pollination contributed to at least 63 of the different crops grown in Anolaima. And again, we see a lower diversity of crops grown for commercialization. Crops that benefited from animal pollination included squash and guatila, important to secure livelihoods, and the most frequent and abundant crop in Anolaima, coffee. Something that is important is that tomato, which benefits little, and peas, beans, which don't benefit from this pollination, were the most popular cash crops after coffee, and those with the highest use of agrochemicals. Passion fruits used to be grown in Anolaima but are not grown anymore because of the high costs of agrochemicals and management. We evaluated predictors of crop diversity through general linear models focusing on the number of subsistence crops, which was best predicted and increased with household size, of farm income sources, and with cash crops. These factors were correlated with the age of the household, farm size, and the use of agrochemicals. So people in larger families with more children grew more food to buffer the need to buy. Households with small farms engaged in more of farm income sources, including low-paid jobs and temporary credits, indicating that the farm may not be large enough to sustain them, and many cash crops were grown with agrochemicals. Something important is that households with elder members did not engage in the use of agrochemicals. Let's see what happens in the world to further contextualize what happens in Anolaima. With time, the area planted with pollinator-dependent crops has increased especially in developing countries, which include most of the tropics. With bee declines, prices for animal-pollinated crops have increased, as well as the demand for animal-pollinated crops in the world. This scenario does not precisely fit Anolaima. Animal pollination is relevant for agriculture, especially for coffee, which in the region has low profitability, and for subsistence crops, which may be really important for large households with smaller farms and for elders. But in general, we can say that Anolaima has lost its potential to grow high-value animal-pollinated crops by specializing in the production of cheap foods. Now let's see what happened with food consumption. In this histogram, we see the number of different foods consumed across households and that most foods were purchased, not grown on farm. Crops grown on farm represented between 9 and 43% of the total household consumption. Let's see what proportion of this was associated to crops benefited by animal pollination. Because of the marked seasonality in the region, I also evaluated whether diets changed across seasons. In the dry season, where few crops are available, during the main harvest season, and during the wet season, when a broader diversity of crops are available. In this graph, we see the percentages of food items consumed by households and whether they were grown on farm on the right or purchased on the left. In this panel, we see what happened for crops not benefited by animal pollination. So people consumed more purchased foods than subsistence foods, and this trend did not change across seasons. People frequently consumed tubers, plantain, rice, and pasta, cheap foods in general. The contribution of animal pollination in the upper panels was on average low, 18%, compared to what we have heard about 2 out of 3 bites of the foods we consumed in industrialized countries coming from animal pollinated crops. Foods benefited by animal pollination in Anolaima were mainly purchased, and we see that in general the percent of each category of foods did not change across seasons, but if we take a look at these boxes, we can see what income allows. People don't harvest many crops for which pollination is essential during the dry season, but they compensate by purchasing. This is the case of squash. Dietary diversity increased with the presence of women in focus households and with the number of purchased foods, which was in turn associated with higher off-farm incomes, level of formal education, and farm size. From our interviews, we know that when food prices go up, people eliminate meat, fruits, and vegetables and switch to crops grown on farm, mainly. All this coincides with a context where crop diversity is decreasing globally, diets are homogenizing, and lower dietary diversity has been associated to increased malnourishment. Our results show that inequality in food access is influenced by socioeconomic differentiation, whereby higher incomes give more alternatives to diversify diets and access micronutrients contained in animal pollinated crops. So, do households differ in their vulnerability to potential pollinator declines? Yes. People in larger households and smaller farms access crops benefited by animal pollination when they grow them, but otherwise they cannot afford them. And people accessing higher incomes, cultivating foods with agrochemicals or not growing food, can purchase foods benefited by animal pollination. So we can say that animal pollination benefits Anolaiman households mainly through crop production as compared to food consumption, that Anolaima has lost its productive advantage as a fruit-producing territory, which is associated to agrarian change, and that people accessing smaller farms and incomes and in larger households greatly rely on subsistence crops and are more vulnerable to the consequences of potential pollinator declines. And that in general, animal pollinated crops are becoming luxury goods in this region. With this I finish. Thanks again for listening, to the pollinators, to all the people that share with me, to collaborators and funders, and to the organizers of this Feral Conference. Thank you.